Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming back to the channel David Warner Mathisen. Hi David, how are you?
Hi, Esoteric. Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So today, can you talk to us about the tale of two kings?
Yes, that's what I was planning on talking about. I've got some prepared visuals. I know that some people might only be listening, but if you're able to look at the screen, I can share some slides as well if you want, and we'll explore some of the ancient wisdom that's been given to humanity. These are like an inheritance for the family of humanity. All these different ancient stories, I'm convinced, have something profound to offer to us right now, right where we are in this present day, even in this present moment. So I'm really excited to talk about these two kings that I've selected are contrasting figures, King Solomon and King Midas. And we'll talk about judgment and discernment and just all kinds of, you may think these are stories about people that you can't relate to at all, but as it turns out, these are really stories about you and me. At least that's that's what I'm going to labor to demonstrate today. So can I share? Let's see if I can
Yes, you should be able to share.
effectively share the screen here. Get it ready on this end. Yeah, I'm really happy that you invited me back, and I hope that this will be something positive for everyone who's listening.
Yeah.
But just by way of introduction or reintroduction, those who haven't heard our previous conversations, Esoteric, I'll just put it right out front that what I've been exploring for the past 12 or 13 plus years now is the abundant evidence, the overwhelming evidence that all the world's ancient myths, or maybe I should say virtually all the world's ancient myths, are built on this common system of celestial metaphor, esoteric metaphor, and that includes the stories of the Bible. And so let's dive into my presentation here. Really looking forward to this. And as I was saying in this introduction, the stories in the Bible can be shown with evidence, demonstrated with abundant evidence. There's just so much evidence. It's really conclusive, I would argue. At the very least, it's extremely compelling. I would say it's conclusive evidence that the stories of the Bible are built on celestial metaphor. So I've tried to illustrate that with a photograph I found in the public domain of a Bible printed in 1604, and I've placed it on a foundation of the constellations. You can see the line of the ecliptic. I've made that in orange. So that's the path of the sun and the planets and the moon. They travel through this background of constellations, the zodiac. And then I also have, you can see the Milky Way. I've sketched in a couple of constellations going up along the Milky Way. These are very mythologically important constellations, Ophiuchus and Hercules. We'll have an opportunity to examine a little bit about those constellations, but I've placed the Bible on top of those because those form the foundation for the stories in the Bible. And that is what I'm trying to show with the arrangement here. The Bible is founded, it's got its foundation. It is like a structure that is founded on this solid foundation of celestial metaphor. And that is in common with myth worldwide. And that's really, I just want to pause. That's really what I want to demonstrate because it is so profound. It shows that there's not a difference in origin between the stories that form the foundation of these different religions that we're familiar with today and the stories that are, derogatively called pagan, there is no difference between the Bible stories and the quote unquote pagan myths. They are all based on the same foundation. They are all, I'm convinced, there to show us profound esoteric truths, the same profound esoteric truths. They just use different stories and different figures to put forth those esoteric messages, but it's the same underlying messages. And that really flies in the face of beliefs that are still around. We may think, oh, we're in this modern era, but if you say something like that, Christianity and paganism, no difference. Well, obviously, there are differences, but foundationally, the stories that gave rise to what we know as, the Christian religion today is built, though the Christian religion is built on those stories. Those stories are based on the same worldwide system. Now, I would argue that literalist Christianity or literalism often goes off in it can head into some very twisted directions because it's taking something esoteric literally. And so it can end up in some very distorted places, as we've talked about last time. It can actually invert the message, the esoteric message, by taking it literally. So I just wanted to put that right out front because I know, there are listeners who might be really maybe put off by that or shocked by that. And if you don't want to, get into this evidence, by no means am I trying to force this on anybody or step on anybody's beliefs. But I would argue that this understanding really helps us to see there's profound truth and profound beauty in these stories. You really don't lose any of the positive aspects through this understanding, but some of those negative things that come out from literalism, such as the exclusivity, we have the only faith, that this clearly shows that is a mistake, because the stories of the Bible are based on the same thing that the Greek myths, the myths of ancient Egypt, the myths of ancient India, the myths of cultures in Africa, cultures in Australia, cultures in the islands of the Pacific, Polynesia, cultures in the Americas, the North American native cultures and the civilizations, the Maya and Aztecs and cultures in Central and South America that had those pyramids, and their systems are based on the same ancient worldwide foundation, which is astonishing and really just has a lot of ramifications for even the way we still see the world today. We think we're so enlightened, but I would argue that this kind of triumphalism or exclusivity of, we've got the one religion that was built, founded by God and better than all the others, is still playing its way out in political attitudes, even if it's not overtly religious today. So this is really, I would argue, a profound, we could just stop right there and talk about the implications of this for a couple hours, but I'm going to, proceed and show some evidence in the story of Solomon and try and argue what it's intended for, unless you want to interact with any of that that I've thrown out so far. Go right ahead. Okay, I'll proceed. Thanks. All right, so and I underline worldwide. This is around the world. It's just so important to understand this. The myths of Japan, the myths of ancient China, the myths of, like I said, ancient India and ancient Egypt, all around the world. This should really unite us. And these, literalist interpretations often end up dividing us. So let's dive into the story of Solomon, because that's the one that I wanted to choose. I'm just about to publish another course. I've got some courses now that are online. I'm about to publish the Celestial Bible Tour course, part 2, which concludes with the story of Solomon. So I'm going to give a little kind of sampling of some of the subjects that we explore in the Celestial Bible Tour part 2. Part 1 starts with Adam and Eve and goes through the flood of Noah, all examining how these are celestial stories with an esoteric purpose. And part 2, we pick up with the story of Joseph in Egypt, and then that's a completely new course. Part 1 ended up with the children of Israel, and then the children of Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. We concluded there on Celestial Bible Tour Part 1. And we're really diving into each of these stories in a lot of depth in these courses. So Part 2 goes from Joseph to Moses and some of the stories in Judges, and then the establishment of the kingdom under David. And then it concludes really with Solomon. So this is a depiction of, it's called The Vision of Solomon. This was painted by an artist named Luca de Giordano, who lived from 1634 to 1705. And you can see in this painting, Solomon, he's down in the lower right-hand corner of your screen as you're facing the painting. He's asleep. This is from a passage in 1 Kings chapter 3, when Solomon has finally kind of consolidated his reign. After the death of David, it's really a Game of Thrones situation. There's a lot of struggle over who is going to be king after David. And David has many different wives, and he has many different sons by these different wives. And there's all kinds of struggle during David's lifetime between different factions led by one or another of his sons. But in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon, whom David said, "You're going to be the king after me." Solomon is the son of David by Bathsheba, and Solomon becomes the king. And now that he's kind of established peace and things have quieted down, he goes up on this mountain, Mount Gibeon, to make offerings to the Lord, burnt offerings. And then it says, and then he had a vision by night while he was asleep on Mount Gibeon, and the Almighty came to him, the Lord. The text calls it the Lord, and then in the very same verse a little later on, God said. So it's the Lord God comes to Solomon and says, "Solomon, ask me what you want. Ask what you want me to give to you. Ask, and I will give it to you." And so this is a really important passage, and we're all probably fairly familiar with the Solomon story. He's a pretty well-known figure in the Bible. A lot of esoteric tradition actually around Solomon. Solomon, of course, King Solomon is known as the wisest to ever live. Why was he the wisest to ever live? Because of this episode right here. In the dream, in the vision, Solomon says, "Well, you've shown such great mercy to me. You've made me the king of this great people, this numberless people. The magnitude of this people is so great, I can't even count them," which right there is already indicating this might not be a literal king, but rather he might be talking about the stars of the sky, which you can't number. But he says, "I'm in charge of this numberless people." At least he's exaggerating. They can't be counted. "And I feel like a little child. I am but a little child," is what he says. "I don't know how to go out or come in, and I have to judge. I have to make decisions. And I feel like a little child trying to make decisions that are way over my head. Please give your servant a wise and understanding heart so that I may judge rightly among the people." So it's an incredibly important passage. he asked for wisdom, and God says, well, the text says, this answer pleased the Lord. And God says, because you've asked for that, I'm going to give you a wise and understanding heart. And you could have asked for some other things. I'm going to give you those too. But it said this answer pleased God, and he gave him this divine wisdom to where he could judge right from wrong. And then right after that is this famous episode that we'll look at just briefly. We'll touch on the episode of the judgment of Solomon, it's called, where he has to judge between these two mothers with the two babies. But just think about, how would you like to always know the right answer? You know, Solomon, right after this vision, is going to face a difficult decision where he has to choose between these two mothers and these two babies. And it's a really difficult situation, but he demonstrates vision and clarity and is able to sort out this really difficult choice. Just imagine if every choice that you ever faced, you could clearly see the right answer. Wouldn't that be, maybe it would be boring, but I think that we would probably, if you can think in your own life of, you know, a really difficult dilemma or situation, maybe you're facing one right now where you're trying to figure out the right course. If you could have like divine insight or divine wisdom given to you to where you could see through the confusion, just imagine how powerful that would be. And so in this short presentation, I just want to see if we can get some answers as to how we can actually experience that. You know, by the end by the end of this little presentation, you will have access to that same source that Solomon has. Well, at least I'll do my best to explore this text a little bit. But so this is an example of, you know, getting really good judgment. And as we mentioned at the very outset, we're going to contrast. Actually, in the Greek myths, this exact same pattern comes up more than once. There's different stories in the Greek myths where someone has to judge or has to choose. A god or goddess will say, you can have whatever you want. What would you like? And Midas actually got that choice. We'll take a look at Midas in a minute. But just before I leave this painting, there's actually a lot of celestial features in this painting. There's even some kind of classical, on this, just above the sleeping Solomon, there's a figure who almost looks like the goddess of wisdom, the goddess Athena, right, kind of right above sleeping Solomon. So he's choosing wisdom. There's this kind of smoky column going up. If you haven't heard my earlier conversation with Esoteric, maybe it was a year ago or so, we looked at the story of Jacob's ladder as one of the Bible texts that we examined, and there was some artwork that was very similar, and we talked about celestial foundations for that. But I want to point out, as I said at the outset, I don't believe these are literal stories at all. These are not historical figures. This is not a historical king. I know that might be upsetting to some people, but I'm not saying that it's not a true story full of profound truth for our lives, but I'm saying I'm convinced it's not a literal story. It's an esoteric story. It's a metaphorical story. So don't get hung up on the different ways that people portray Solomon. Like in this one, he's got kind of long blonde hair. You know, he's a youthful Solomon. Usually we see Solomon with a big curly beard. At least that's how I've most commonly seen him. But don't get hung up on, oh, this painter is painting Solomon one way. There's lots of different portrayals. Solomon's been portrayed many different ways. I'll show you. Here's one from the 1300s by actually an Italian. Well, it wasn't a country, Italy at that time, but Duccio de Buoninsegna is from the city of Segna, I believe, or Senia in Italy, who lived in 1255 to 1318. So this is in the 13th century. This is probably painted in the 1200s. So there's, you know, different traditions about, you know, Solomon's characteristics and background, he's not a literal figure. You can imagine him in many different ways. This is an icon from a Russian church. This was, I believe, from the 1500s. It's way up north of Moscow, in the northwest of Russia. This church is still standing. I believe you can go. It's a church of Saint Cyril, Cyril. I think they pronounce it differently in Russian. But Solomon and Ezekiel over there, they both have scrolls, and it's in Cyrillic. So I can't read it, but that is Solomon on the left. You can see his crown. And so what did Solomon look like? Well, he looked like a constellation. We'll see later. He's not a literal person. He's actually he's something or someone to whom we all have. These stories are actually all about us. And Solomon is a principle that we all have access to. It's actually a picture of higher self. We'll get into that in a little bit. So what did Solomon physically look like is kind of that's a blind alley if you go down that road, because these are not literal stories. These are celestial stories, as I'll show in a little bit. But now let's contrast Solomon's choice with King Midas. And so this is a picture from the early 1900s or late 1800s, a picture book of different stories. Actually, it was stories written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's a really early American short story and essayist and novelist. One of my favorite authors, actually, Nathaniel Hawthorne. But this collection of Nathaniel Hawthorne's tales was republished after Hawthorne was dead for decades. But this was a later illustration that was put to some of his writings about the story of King Midas. We're all pretty familiar with the story of King Midas. King Midas was the king of Phrygia, and he was known as the wealthiest king, the wealthiest man on earth. And actually in the story, the way he gets his wishes, or he gets one wish, is if you go back to the ancient accounts of the Midas story, there was this drinking companion of the god Dionysus. So Dionysus was the god of wine. It's also known as Bacchus, more by the Romans, but even in ancient Greece, I believe that name Bacchus or Bacchus was there in ancient Greek and Roman, god of wine and the vine. And he had this drinking companion named Silenus. And Silenus one day got drunk. In some versions of the story, some people tricked Silenus by putting wine into a well. So Silenus, thinking he was going to get some water out of the well, drank a big bucket full of wine. And then he said, well, that was good. I'll have some more. Got really drunk, passed out in the woods. And some people in the kingdom of King Midas found Silenus passed out and brought Silenus to the king. And Midas said, oh, this is Silenus, the drinking companion of the god Dionysus. Let's entertain him. Let's get him sobered up. Let's give him some coffee or whatever. And we'll have a big feast. And Silenus, he loves to party. We'll have a great time, day after day of feasting. And when Silenus feels better, we'll send him back to Dionysus, all rejuvenated. And so he does. And Dionysus comes to Midas and he says, thank you for returning Silenus, for taking care of him when he was drunk and passed out. Because of that, I'm going to give you whatever you want, Midas. What do you want? And we all know the story of King Midas, right? What is it? He wishes for, of course, like Solomon, wisdom, right? No, that's not what Midas asked for. And Midas, even when he was a young man, was told, you're going to become the king of Phrygia and be the wealthiest man in the world. So he has gold, as much as he could possibly need. He's the richest king, the king of Phrygia, and which is in like modern day Turkey area. And actually he's the legendary founder of Ankara, I believe, according to myth. King Midas founded that city that's still there today. But he wished for, as everybody knows, the golden touch. I don't have enough gold. I've got more than anybody else, but I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And in the ancient accounts, There's a poem by Ovid that describes this. There's others that are more ancient than Ovid too, but Ovid was a famous Roman poet. He talks about Midas just becoming delighted, touching twigs on trees and turning them to gold and just falling down laughing. He's so tickled that he can turn anything he wants to gold. He even turns, clumps of dirt into gold, big nuggets of gold, and he's overjoyed. But then, as I'm sure everybody listening knows, he says, I'm kind of hungry. All this turning things into gold has been fun. It's been a great afternoon, but I'm going to go get some dinner. And you can see in this illustration in the foreground, there's a little table. There's some fishes on there, and there's a fork, maybe some peaches or some other fruit there. In the story, he picks up his fork, it turns to gold. He puts the fork into some, sausages or something and puts it into his mouth. No problem while he's lifting it up to his mouth, but once it touches his teeth, it turns to gold. He almost breaks his teeth. He's horrified. He says, "Oh, that's not good." And he reaches for his goblet of wine, tries to take a sip, almost chokes because it turns into solid gold, as minute as it touches his tongue and the back of his throat. And he has to pull the solid wine out of his throat. And he realizes this wish I just had is a death sentence. I've chosen cold, dead money over the things that give life. So this is certainly an applicable story for our modern age, probably for rulers of any era. But then even in some versions of the story, as we see here, is kind of the most horrifying part. His daughter comes running up to him to give him a big hug. She hasn't seen him all day. He's been out busy turning things into gold. He says, no, don't touch me. And she gives him a hug anyway, not able to stop, and turns to gold. And so now Midas is heartbroken. Not only does he realize he's going to die because he can't eat or drink, but now even his future, his children have been cut off because of his horrible, bad judgment in asking. Even though he already had all the gold he needed, he couldn't get enough. This is like a picture of addiction, a picture of really something wrong psychologically with Midas. Like, what is wrong with you? You have everything you want, but you need more. It can't satisfy you. It's actually a picture of us as well. These are all stories that pertain to our own situation. And I think I might have referred in the previous conversation, but certainly in many of my books in recent years, I've talked about some of the cutting edge healers and psychologists and doctors who deal with addiction, such as Dr. Gabor Mate, who explains that addiction to anything, self-harming inability to get enough of something, it could be to a drug, but it could be to almost anything. It could be to different behaviors. It could be to shopping. It could be to gold, like Midas's case. But that's self-harming, but you can't stop, which Midas is like a perfect picture of that. Self-harming addiction is caused by separation from self. It's caused by suppression of our own self, which is a very common condition in the modern era, but apparently was something that the ancients also realized was a problem. It's such a problem. The reason it's such a terrible problem is we don't even know that it happens. We don't even know that we become separated from self. It's something that happens often with childhood. Psychologists call it attachment injury. It has to do with when there's some kind of an attachment injury with your parents, and the child, instead of fully understanding, the child turns inward and says, I have to suppress this part of me to make my parents love me, or to prevent that from happening. Or if something bad happens to the child automatically, as a defense mechanism, will turn and say, well, it must be something that I did wrong, because that gives more control psychologically, well, if I did it wrong, then I can fix it. If it just happened randomly, that's terrifying. I can't do anything about it. So we have this mechanism, and we'll actually separate from our own self. And that separation from self is what leads to trauma and the need to have something. It's like trying to assuage that alienation, that loss, that grief over that injury that we're still carrying, will lead to all these different addictions. So Midas is demonstrating that. And I'm actually going to go even a little bit further into the Midas story and show that this is also a celestial story. This is a painting by a very famous artist, Nicolas Poussin, 1594 to 1665, one of the most influential and famous painters actually of that period. And this is the reconciliation of Midas. This is called Midas bathing at the river Pactolus. In the story, Dionysus, who, when Midas asked for gold, Dionysus knew, oh, Midas, you don't want to ask for that, but okay, I'll give it to you. Dionysus comes back to Midas and he says, how's things going, Midas? How are you liking the wish that you made? And Midas says, it's terrible. He falls down in front of Dionysus and he says, I've made a terrible mistake. I have ruined my life. I've killed my daughter. Would you please undo this wish? I don't deserve it, but could you give me one more, grant me one more favor and undo everything that I just did? And Dionysus is merciful to Midas and he says, yes, I knew this was going to happen. Go wash in the river Pactolus. Go all the way to its source. Find the source of the river Pactolus and wash in the river. And when you do that, the curse will be undone, because it turned into a curse, didn't it, Midas? And Midas said, yeah, what a curse it was. And so this is Midas. You can see he's stricken with grief. He's washing there in the river. He's crying, over probably his daughter. He's hung his royal robes up there on a branch of the tree. I don't know if that's supposed to be Dionysus next to him, or maybe just maybe even Silenus. I don't know. But in this painting, Nicolas Poussin is trying to capture this grief of Midas, washing at the river Pactolus. And then the myths say all the things that he turned to gold were turned back to their normal state, including his daughter. So the gods were merciful to Midas. And the only consequence actually was the river Pactolus now has flakes of gold. If you go far enough up, you can pan for gold and get some flakes of gold in the river Pactolus, according to the ancient myths. So I want to show, before I go back to Solomon, that this story of Midas is based on celestial metaphor. I've talked about this in some blog posts and different books that I've written. I actually have a book that came out in 2020 called Myth and Trauma, where I talk a little bit about this story. Actually, I've come back to it a few times, the story of Midas. But let me show you this particular part of the sky is maybe unfamiliar to viewers, but there's probably one constellation on here. I don't believe this constellation really figures in this story to any great degree, but this is a constellation you might be familiar with. If you look towards the left edge of the screen, kind of a little bit below halfway down, you'll see the 3-star belt of Orion. I'm just going to outline Orion. I'll put kind of the two halves of Orion on either side of that distinctive 3-star belt, one of the most distinctive features of the night sky that, if you're familiar with any constellation, you're probably familiar with the 3-star belt of Orion. So that's where Orion is located. Now I'm going to move a little bit towards the top of the screen and show you another constellation. This is actually another constellation with a lot of bright stars, a fairly visible and noticeable and important constellation. This is the constellation Perseus, or Perseus. Some people pronounce it Perseus. I've heard from Greek experts that EU is a diphthong, like in Zeus. We don't say Zeus, so it's probably not Perseus, it's probably Perseus. But either way, that's the figure who in some myths becomes the hero Perseus. So these constellations will play different figures. And I'm going to demonstrate that Perseus is the figure of Midas. You can see Perseus has two arms. These are the actual outlines of the stars in the sky. And this is the outlining system of H.A. Rey. I may have mentioned it before. H.A. Rey, who wrote Curious George, very important book that he wrote in 1952 called The Stars, A New Way to See Them. It's actually a very ancient way to see them. We can demonstrate that H.A. Rey's outlining system is very ancient, but his outlining system is extremely helpful for seeing the connections between the myths and the stars, including the stories in the Bible and the stars. So Perseus has this one arm that the stars actually kind of loop around. It looks almost like a hook on the left side that features in some myths. But on the other side, you can see this kind of outstretched arm, and it's reaching towards another constellation that I'm going to outline for you. This is the constellation Andromeda. So Andromeda, in the Perseus story, Perseus rescues Andromeda. She's chained to a rock. You can see she's got her legs in this outline towards Perseus. Those are envisioned as her legs facing towards Perseus, and then her body, her torso is kind of triangular. Then she has two outstretched arms, one of which actually looks like it has a little chain on the end of it, like she's been chained to the rock. And then she's got kind of a long neck, and the head is designated just by one star. But that's the outline of the beautiful Andromeda. So remember, in the story of Midas, his daughter comes running up to him, and he says, no, don't touch me. But she touches him, and she turns to gold. I'm convinced that this is demonstrating that. It's illustrating that in the heavens. And let me show you why. There's lots of evidence that Midas is actually associated with Perseus. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but just remember, Midas, he's this illustration of bad judgment. We'll get back to Solomon, good judgment, in a moment. But remember, Dionysus was merciful to Midas and said, hey, go dunk your head in the river Pactolus, go all the way up to its source. And so on the head of Perseus, you can see the kind of pointy hat that the outline actually has in the sky. That outline in the sky, I argue, is where we get this tradition. It's an ancient tradition of the Phrygian cap. So Midas is the king of Phrygia, and there's a cap that's depicted in ancient statues and ancient artwork that is called the Phrygian cap. It looks kind of like floppy, like a pointy hat that kind of flops over. It's also called a Liberty cap in the 1700s, but it also has kind of like ear flaps on some versions of the Phrygian cap, ear flaps. And you can look at Perseus, the kind of rectangular head and pointy hat, and kind of imagine a Phrygian cap, even with ear flaps. I mean, look at it. Actually, a lot of these symbolic or ritualistic forms of headgear come from the stars, I argue. I'm the only one I know who has argued that, but Midas is definitely the king of Phrygia. That's in the ancient accounts, and he's associated with Perseus. I'll show you some more evidence, but this is another piece of evidence. Perseus wears a Phrygian cap. So then he dunks that head in the river Pactolus, or he swims in the river Pactolus or bathes there. There's actually a Bible story where somebody has to go bathe in a river also to become cleansed from leprosy. There's a Bible story there in the stories of the prophet Elisha. But this is a story of Midas. We'll focus on that. We'll get back to the Bible a little later. Perseus is actually located, the constellation Perseus, high up on the Milky Way. I say high up because it's very far from the galactic center. The brightest part of the Milky Way is down by Sagittarius and Scorpio. This is almost the complete other side of the sky from Sagittarius and Scorpio in the brightest part of the Milky Way. So this is like the source of the Pactolus River. Anyway, I'm arguing that the Pactolus River that Midas is told to go bathe in is the Milky Way. And that part of the story is there because Perseus, the constellation that Midas is associated with, is bathing or even dunking his head in the Milky Way. So the story has celestial foundations. There's still more to the story of Midas. He actually is given ass's ears or donkey ears in another episode of Bad Judgment, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And there's a constellation right between Perseus and Orion called Taurus, which has long horns. But those long horns in some myths actually are envisioned, instead of as being horns of a bull, as being the long ears of a donkey or an ass. And so Midas getting ass's ears, as we'll see in a moment, is also another clue that we're in the right part of the sky here for our identification of Midas. Let me actually talk about that story. So Midas is constantly exhibiting bad judgment. I'm contrasting him to Solomon. And not only does, when he's given this request, he, one wish from Dionysus, he makes a terrible choice. And I would argue that's because there's something wrong with him. He's exhibiting the kinds of self-destructive things that we ourselves do. If we're honest about it, we will admit we often make the wrong call, and then later we look back and say, why did I do that? It's almost like sometimes we're trying to sabotage ourselves. And the Midas wish was certainly self-sabotaging. He found he couldn't even eat or drink. But in a different story, he also exhibits bad judgment in the story of Marsyas. So Marsyas, we'll talk about Marsyas in a minute, is a satyr or a faun. And you can see on the right side of this painting, this is a painting by a Dutch artist named Hendrik de Klerk. I didn't put his name on there because just there's a lot going on in this painting. But in this painting, Marsyas is known as the father of the flute, or the inventor of the flute. Now, in the myths, Marsyas didn't actually invent the flute. The goddess Athena invented the flute, or the pipes, the pan pipes. It's usually like two flutes. And she invented them, and she was playing her invention and kind of liked the sound that it was making, but she caught a glimpse of herself in a lake, and she didn't like the way it distorted her face, and she threw them away. And then this satyr came up, Marsyas, he has the legs of a goat, and picked them up. And because they were made by a goddess, they worked fantastically. And he started playing them. He said, wow, I can really play the flute. Man, I am good. And he challenged Apollo, the god of music, to he unwisely challenged Apollo, the god of music, to a contest. Well, if Apollo is the very god of music, the origin of musical skill, it would be foolish to challenge him. That's where you got your musical ability from, Marsyas. But Marsyas challenges Apollo to a contest, and Midas sets himself up as the judge. Bad judgment, King Midas sets himself up as the judge. And as you can see in this painting, Apollo is kind of in the center. He's radiant. He's playing a violin because this Dutch artist in the 1600s depicted his harp as a violin. He's got Athena, the goddess, next to him. And Midas is pointing his little scepter at Marsyas, saying, Marsyas wins. Bad judgment from Midas part 2, because obviously Marsyas is not better than the god of music himself. So Apollo says, Midas, you just have bad judgment. You got bad hearing. You got bad judgment. From now on, you will have ass's ears. So you see that Midas is growing donkey ears there. So a lot of artists depict Midas. You can see him with his staff out. Let me actually blow it up a little bit bigger. You can see there's from left to right, we've got Athena, then Apollo, then maybe that same satyr figure that hangs out with King Midas. That might be Silenus, the old man with a beard there. And then there's Midas with his donkey ears. pointing to the satyr Marsyas, saying, "The winner." And Apollo says, "Wrong. Midas, you need to learn to hear better." And so we'll take a look at another example of a painting. This one's much more recent than that previous one by Hendrik de Klerk. Now we've got Apollo with an actual harp or lyre, but this is by Émile Lévy from 1845. Émile Lévy. I don't speak French very well, but he was a painter in the late 1800s. You can see again, we've got Midas. I'm gonna try and get get us out of the way. There's Midas, Marsyas, and Apollo. I don't know if you can see, but Midas has ass's ears here. He's looking really pleased with himself as he awards the winner's crown to Marsyas. And Marsyas is holding his pipes up in the air, and Apollo is like, "Midas, you're just a king with bad judgment. You always make the wrong choice, Midas." So let's go back to the actual constellation in the sky. Can you see Midas as Perseus? This time he's pointing to Andromeda, just like in the paintings where he's pointing a scepter at Marsyas. In this case, Marsyas with his satyr legs and is Andromeda. I know that seems like, wait a minute, I thought Andromeda was a beautiful woman. Andromeda can also play a satyr. That's why Perseus or Midas is always hanging out with satyrs. And Andromeda, remember I pointed out the chains. If you look at her outstretched arm over her head, that's the panpipes that Marsyas was playing. So I left Marsyas up on the screen, the word Marsyas, so you could see how to spell it if you want to go look up Marsyas yourself. So all these stories about Midas and his bad judgment are also celestial. These are based on the same celestial foundations, and we'll go back to the Bible in a moment. But Apollo punished Midas by making him have donkey ears, but he punished Marsyas in an even more disturbing way. Marsyas was hung on a tree upside down and then flayed alive. So flaying, of course, means removing the skin. And so Marsyas was flayed alive. And this is a painting by Titian, famous painter from the 1500s, Titian, of the flaying of Marsyas. So you can look up Marsyas and find other paintings. You can see he's hung upside down by the tree, just like you would skin a deer or something. And his fawn legs, he's got animal legs and a human torso. His panpipes are hanging from the branch, and he's in big trouble. Now he's going to be skinned alive. It's a horrible story. There's another fawn coming along saying, "Oh, here's a bucket for the blood that's going to ensue when you pull his skin. You're going to cut his skin off and pull it down over his head." Now, why does Marsyas get killed in that particular way? It's because Marsyas is associated with Andromeda. I'm going to show you one more. There are many different flayings in different myths around the world, but a lot of them have to do with this feature in the sky that's right next to Andromeda. In fact, the head of Andromeda, if you look at Andromeda, look at the head of Andromeda, there's one star there. There's a square in the sky. It's very distinctive. And one of those points of the square is the head of Andromeda. I'll draw in the rest of them. I'll draw it in red because Marsyas is being flayed alive. He's having his skin pulled off down over his head. That's the great square. It's called the great square. Sometimes it's called the great square of Pegasus, because on one side is Andromeda, on the other side is Pegasus. You can see it's attached to kind of a horse-looking figure on the opposite side from Andromeda. In some myths, there's a myth in ancient Japan where a horse is flayed backwards. Well, that's the same great square. So when you see a horse being flayed, or when you see a satyr, in this case, being flayed, that's the great square, is the skin being pulled off. So it's not that Apollo literally had this satyr flayed alive. This is an esoteric story. It's a metaphorical story. It is based on celestial metaphor, and it has to do with bad judgment. It has to do with choosing wrongly. And so now we can go back to the story of Solomon, where he's asked, "What do you want?" And he says in 1 Kings 3, I've got the text over here. He says, "I feel like a little child. I need judgment. And not just judgment for me, not just so that my life goes well, but you've put me in a position of authority. I need to be able to judge rightly for the people, for the nation. I'm in charge of making decisions. People will come to me and ask what should be done. And I feel like a little child. I'm so confused. Would you please give me a wise and understanding heart?" And it says in verse 11 there, God, this answer pleased the Lord. He said, "Because thou hast asked for this thing, wisdom, and has not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, like Midas did." You didn't ask for personal wealth. You didn't ask for long life. You didn't even ask for the hand of thine enemies. So you could have even asked for harm to your enemies, but you didn't do any of those things. Now, the reason I circled those is Solomon is going to the infinite realm here. This is what the myths are actually talking about, is this connection to the invisible world. What can you use it for? Well, you can use it for personal gain, apparently, or even in some circumstances, harm to your enemies, which sounds terrible, but maybe some people use the invisible realm to harm others. But that's not what it's for. That wasn't the right answer. Long life and personal wealth aren't necessarily bad things, but that's not what it's for either. And harm to enemies isn't what it's for. It's actually for wisdom, and not just wisdom for yourself, although that's definitely beneficial, but wisdom to help others. He wants understanding to discern judgment in order to help others. That's the key. And so then the text says, God says to Solomon, "Behold, I've done according to your words. I've given you a wise and understanding heart." And in verse 13, I highlighted it, "I've also given you that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if you will walk in my ways to keep my commandments, then I will lengthen thy days." That's in verse 14, right down below that. So he is given riches and honor and even long life. So up in the top, it says, you didn't ask for long life, but I'll give you that. You didn't ask for personal wealth. I'll throw that in too. There's no mention of harm to enemies. So it's like long life and personal wealth, those aren't bad things. And sometimes you might get those things, but the main thing you're supposed to be asking for is understanding to discern judgment, not just for yourself, but also to help others. That's what I use this passage to try and demonstrate. This is what I believe the myths are actually for. Understanding, and understanding that should also help others too. So harm to enemies was not in the things that God gave to Solomon. And then it says down here below, okay, it's to help others. I already said that. Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So he had this vision. It's in the other realm. It's in the realm of non-ordinary. It's reality, but it's not ordinary reality, not like our waking reality. This is sometimes when we get messages from the divine or from our higher self. So we'll talk a little bit about higher self. I argue that higher self is how we get those messages from the divine. And we all have access to higher self. That's where this is going. We all have access to self. Trauma is separation from self, suppression of self. That's why Midas exhibits this addictive, self-destructive behavior, because he's separated from self. Solomon is actually a picture of self. higher self. Higher self has access to wisdom and clarity and judgment, and even on a level beyond what we should ordinarily be able to grasp in the world of physics. Like sometimes we'll get a message about someone, maybe someone we know or someone related to in a faraway country, and then we'll find out later they'll give us a call or something that same day. How did that happen? It's some kind of a connection that's even beyond what we can explain with physics. So higher self is like a conduit to this higher understanding. And that higher understanding is for judgment and clarity, ideally, not just for ourselves, but also to help others. So he awoke, it was a dream. Not every message we get in a dream is from higher self. I'm not arguing that, but sometimes we will get messages in strange ways, or they'll just come to us. Like we'll wake up in the morning and it didn't necessarily come in a dream, but we'll have some understanding that we didn't have the night before. And it'll just, oh, I see the solution to my problem. I've had that experience, and I'm sure just about everybody, if not everybody listening, probably has had that experience. So immediately after this vision, when he gets his wisdom, in the very next verse, verse 16, the text says, then came two women that were harlots, that is, prostitutes, unto the king, that is, Solomon, and stood before him. And the one woman said, oh, my Lord, I and this woman dwell in this one house. And then they go into this big story. And that's the story of the two women who were prostitutes, and they gave birth 3 days apart. The woman telling the story says, I gave birth, and then 3 days later, she gave birth. And we both had babies. There was no one else in the house, just us and our babies. And her child died during the night. She overlaid it. She lay on top of it, and tragically, her child died. And then the other woman interrupts and says, no, 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 no. That's not how it happened at all. Her child died, and then she switched with me. And then the other one interrupts and says, no, no, no. The dead one is hers. The live one is mine. And Solomon says, how am I going to judge this? She says the live one belongs to her and the dead one belongs to the other. But she says the live one belongs to her and the dead one belongs to the other. Which one's telling the truth? And we're all probably familiar with this story as well. This is a painting by the famous artist Raphael, who lived in the 1400s and early 1500s. And it's showing this famous scene. This has become known as the Judgment of Solomon, where he has to choose or see through this very difficult dilemma. And he says, of course, as we probably all know, we've probably heard this story, bring me a sword. And I always say, when I was a child, I thought Solomon grabbed the sword and said, okay, I'll solve the problem. I'm going to cut it in half. But in the text, it clearly shows he's talking to someone else. He says, bring me a sword. And then he says, cut the child in two and give one half to her and one half to her. And then the two women scream out. One of them says, no, 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 my Lord, please don't cut that baby in two. Give it to her. Don't kill it. Please just let it live. Go ahead and give it to her. And the other one says, no, no, no. I think that's a great plan. Cut it up. Kill it. Which doesn't really make much sense, because a minute ago, they were both trying to get the baby, but now this one wants the baby dead. So Solomon immediately says, stop, I've heard enough. Don't cut that child in two. So we know it's not Solomon swinging the sword, because he says in the text, stop, and in no way cut that baby in half. So we know he's talking to someone else. So as we see in the painting, he's talking to the swordsman over here. Look at the painting. Look at the two women, their gestures, and look at Solomon. He's in between two pillars. As we know, Solomon built the temple, and there's the two pillars of the temple. And then look at that swordsman. He's arching the sword over his head, or he's menacing the baby with a sword. And look at the baby. Look at how the baby is in this arched position. I just wanted to point that out from this painting by Raphael. And then I'm going to go to another painting. This one is by another famous artist, probably not as famous as Raphael, but you may have heard of Peter Paul Rubens. He lived actually roughly the same time, a little after Raphael. But look at the similarities. There's Solomon up on his throne. The throne itself has little pillars, Corinthian columns carved into it, and a seashell. And he's got a little scepter there. The women are in these different postures. And then just, I want to point out the swordsman. He's got the sword over his back. He's got a big beard in this case. The Raphael swordsman didn't have a beard, but he's a pretty burly looking swordsman. And now look at that baby. Again, the baby is arching, very distinctive arch. And babies will arch. It's like a reflex they have when they're really mad or they're really scared, like when you're about to give them a bath or something, or you put them in the bath. An infant will arch like this, get really angry and scream sometimes and arch. So why are the babies always depicted like that? Well, I guess they don't want to get cut in half. But this artistic convention I find very revealing. Let's just point out the sword over the back, and we'll just point out the arch of the baby one more time. And this big burly swordsman holding the baby by one foot, about to cut it in half. And then Solomon is there saying, nope, don't do it. So what's going on? Oh, here's just one more. This is much more recent. This is by James Tissot, who was actually another famous painter right before the Impressionist period. He was really famous. He was more famous than the Impressionists. It's kind of a really interesting story. They asked him to join them and he said, no, I'm too busy, or I've got my own projects going on. So he's less well remembered than people like Monet, but he was very famous at the time. This is his depiction. You can see the pillars again. Solomon in this case has kind of a longish red beard, and the two women. And let's just look at that swordsman, big, burly, bearded swordsman, sword over the back, holding, arching baby. So there's the arch. I'll just draw it in. So this arch, I'm not going to go through the whole, I lay it out in the course, but I really just want to show this story is based on the stars, and it actually has parallels around the world. This is a very important, mythologically important constellation, Hercules. I've shown Hercules connections in a lot of different podcasts, but in this story, I've got a real close up here so you can see the outline of Hercules. Let's outline it so it's really clear. Hercules has in the sky, a pretty square head, and he looks like a powerful figure. That square head gives rise to Hercules figures often having a square, big, full beard, like the actual hero Hercules or Heracles in Greek myth has a big beard, sometimes even wears that lion kind of head cap that makes his head look even more square. You can see this deep lunging posture, which is present in many depictions of Hercules and other figures who are associated with this constellation. Even in the picture of the swordsman in the Solomon paintings, the heel is raised on every single one of them, or at least you can show it in the Raphael and some of the others. And the sword is menacingly held over the back. And here's the really important part. I'm trying to move us out of the way. I don't know if I can kind of make that smaller. Oh, well, you can see it. This is a beautiful arc of stars that's known as the Northern Crown, or Corona Borealis. It's located in the sky right in front of the constellation Hercules. And in many different myths, a Hercules figure will grasp an arc-shaped figure that's related to Corona Borealis, because as you can see, they're very close in the sky. And you can even imagine or envision, obviously none of these lines are present in the night sky, but over and over, cultures around the world base their myths on these same patterns. Very intriguing, because I'll tell you right now, Hercules is not easy to spot unless you know how to find Hercules. But around the world, we have these powerful figures picking up arching babies or other arc-shaped things associated with Hercules and Corona Borealis. And you can imagine a line. You can see that Hercules has this lower outstretched arm. That's not grabbing Corona Borealis, but you could easily envision a line where he is grabbing Corona Borealis. So that is the swordsman that Solomon is talking to, saying, cut that baby in half. Now, let me also point out that envisioning Corona Borealis as a baby is not something you would expect. Sometimes I get this pushback to what I'm trying to explain here. Well, of course, around the world, all the myths are based on stars, because around the world, you can all see these stars. And that is a reasonable objection. But first of all, I don't see that it's obvious at all that just because everyone can see the stars, every culture on Earth would start to independently choose to base their myths on the stars. That in and of itself is intriguing that they all seem to do that. But secondly, the constellations are by no means obvious. Like the outline of Hercules, those are pretty faint stars. And yet we have these powerful Hercules figures with the same characteristics in the myths of ancient Japan, in the Norse myths, in the Greek myths, in the myths of the Yoruba people. Shango, he carries a big axe. I can show you how the stars of that sword-looking object over the head of Hercules could actually be envisioned as an axe. There's 4 little stars in the constellation that could turn it into an axe instead of a sword. And Shango is a powerful thunder god, just like Zeus is a thunder god. Zeus is associated with the same constellation. You wouldn't anticipate that all these different cultures would outline the stars the same way and give them the same characteristics, and yet they do. And then, Corona Borealis, that is pretty easy to see. Almost anyone around the world could pick out Corona Borealis and draw that line the same way. But to me, it's obvious that that looks like a necklace. I could use that in a myth, or a crown, like the Northern Crown. But it's no way is it obvious to look at that and say, I see an arching baby. I'll make a story of Corona Borealis being an arching baby. And yet, in more than one culture, this is exactly what we find. So that argues for some kind of a worldwide connection. So I'll just point that out. So there's some really intriguing aspects to this, but by blowing it up into this big size, hopefully you can see how Hercules is grasping this baby. And Hercules is here in the sky. Let me show you. There's what we just looked at, but a little bit farther away. I'm going to show you, there's Corona Borealis. There's the connection between them that I'm arguing. I'm going to show you a couple images from other ancient artwork. This is a really important new discovery that was dug up in 2017 in a tomb at Pylos. It's called the Pylos Combat Agate. Some people pronounce it Pylos. It's in Western Peloponnese in Greece. This tomb was sealed up in 1500 BC. So this agate was made no later than 1500 BC and probably before. It's an amazing piece of artwork. The details are incredible. But if you look at that swordsman who's got his arm over his head, he's got this exaggerated lunging posture. Look at the posture of Hercules. He's got one arm over his head swinging a sword. He's got one leg sticking way out with the heel raised. But look at his other arm. Hercules in the sky has another arm. This figure in the Pylos Combat Agate, as soon as this was published, this agate, I looked at it and said, this is celestial. I've seen this pattern over and over. And I wrote to different scholarly journals with all the evidence trying to illustrate this. But anyway, I just ended up making videos about it myself because the scholarly community has not yet admitted that this is based on the stars, but it is clearly based on the stars. There's Hercules. Look at the outstretched arm of that swordsman. In his other arm, the one that's not carrying the sword, what's he doing? He's grasping the helmet crest of this warrior that he's about to kill. I'll make it a little bigger, but the helmet crest is in an arc shape, just like Corona Borealis. This is the same constellation. Let's just make it bigger. See that other arm? See him grasping the arc of the unfortunate opponent that he's about to kill with his sword has an arc-shaped helmet crest. Here's Hercules and Corona Borealis, again, in the sky, in the star chart on the right. And then there's Hercules, look, he's got one leg back with the heel raised. This is always the way Hercules gets depicted. He's got a square-shaped head, and he's reaching out with one. He's got a sword in the other hand. He's also about to slay this warrior. This is from later than the Pylos combat agate. This is from about 569 BC, scholars think. Look how he's grasping the helmet crest of that warrior that he's about to kill. You see that? He's grasping. The helmet crest itself is actually a little damaged on this vase, but it would be connected on the top. That's another arc shape that a Hercules figure is grasping. So we're seeing the same pattern is just like this Hercules figure in the painting thousands of years later, thousands of years from the Pylos combat agate to Raphael's painting, but we've got the heel raised, holding something arching with one hand that's outstretched and the other hand holding a sword over your head. So and here, same thing. So there's plenty of other evidence in this whole story that the whole thing is celestial and that it's esoteric. And it's, by esoteric, I mean, it is teaching us something other than, this is a story about an ancient king who was wiser than anybody before or since. Because think about it. If Solomon was the most wise who's ever lived, no one after him will ever be as wise as he. How does that help you to know that? It's like, okay, great. Solomon was wise, but the text says no one will ever be that wise again. So I actually kind of feel more like Midas. I always make the wrong choice. How, what's the good of the story? It's esoteric in that this story is not about a literal historical figure. This is a story about us. And actually, it's a story about higher self and recovering higher self from whom we become separated. In my course, I really spend a lot of time. Actually, that theme runs through all my analysis of the Bible stories, is this theme of trauma and separation from self. We see trauma throughout the Bible stories, and we actually see separation from self. We see it right from the beginning in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are naked and unashamed, and then trauma, they're uncomfortable in their own skin. They're ashamed, they cover themselves, they hide from God, they get kicked out of the garden, they're separated from nature. Trauma separates us from ourselves, and then it separates us from one another. They start accusing each other. They get separated from nature, and they even get separated from the divine. Recovery of self is how we get back in harmony with ourselves, and that can lead us to harmony with others and harmony with nature. We get back in connection with nature and back in connection with the divine, and that is how we start to access better judgment and better clarity. But when we're divided against ourselves, we do self-destructive, nonsensical things like Midas choosing Marsyas's music over Apollo's music, clearly nonsensical, or doing self-destructive things like saying, let everything I touch turn to gold. Oh, I didn't think about that one very much. Or this woman in this story, we see her doing, she's overcome with grief, and she's kind of out of her mind, where she says, no, cut the baby in half. She's so grief-stricken that she's about to sabotage her whole plan, which was to try and get the baby. She's like, if I don't get it, nobody gets it, which is like, I'm willing to destroy myself just to spite others. That is traumatic it's like self-loathing. It's like hurting your own self and your own future. It's being depicted in these stories. But these ancient myths are actually pointing us towards how we get back in touch, how we recover self. And through that, then we can start acting more like Solomon than like Midas. But we don't do it by trying, by effort, by what's actually going on is all these different parts of who we are will do things that turn out to be self-destructive, they're actually trying to do, this is a paradigm that more recently I've learned about, the psychological paradigm of Dr. Richard Schwartz, another healer who deals with trauma and kind of self-destructive behavior. And he realized that we all have multiple parts that are gifted and play positive roles, but will get out of harmony with one another and get polarized and actually act at cross purposes to one another, just like the two women in this story. But there is another aspect that we all have access to, which is self, deeper self. I like to call it deeper self. Some people are familiar with the phrase higher self. That's more common. Solomon actually is depicting this wisdom that we actually have access to, who can heal the situation, who can see through the trauma and actually start to heal it, is our own self. And so Solomon, to be like Solomon, you don't try and imitate Solomon. To be like Solomon, you start to realize that you've been separated from self, first of all, because we don't even realize that we've done it. The defense mechanism that I was trying to describe earlier, we do that unconsciously. It's so painful that we actually suppress even the idea that we have separated from self. So if someone comes up to you and says, hey, you need to get back in touch with self, you'll have defensive parts that will spring into action and say, what are you talking about? Don't give me that new age crap. Separated from self. What? Ha ha ha! I've got everything under control. That's like layer one, is even realizing that this happened. The myths show it to us in dramatic fashion, and then they start to show us to recover. We have to realize we've been separated from self, and the myths dramatize the way we go about that. And actually, the self will come out as we start to let those defensive parts take a break and step back. Self will actually come to the fore, the parts that are holding it down. If you ask them, Dr. Richard Schwartz calls it unblending. If you ask them to just go take a break, say, look, I appreciate what you're doing, but can you turn off that defense mechanism for a minute? Just go read a book or sit under a tree. Self will actually come to the fore, and you'll start to have access to the kinds of characteristics that we all have access to through self. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but I want to point out that the myths around the world are trying to teach us this lesson through their stories, their dramatizations. They are superficially different, but deep down they're showing us the same truth, because this is true about our condition. All these different players in the myths are actually in our own inner landscape. This is the story of Maui. In the story of Maui, when he's first born as an infant, his mother throws him into the sea foam, and some of the traditions say the jellyfishes kind of gathered around him to protect him from the flies and the birds that wanted to eat him alive. And then his powerful ancestor or grandfather, Tamanui, came and he looked down, he saw something strange in the sea foam there. He said, what are all those jellyfish and birds doing? And he picked it. Oh, it's an infant. And he lifted him up. In some versions of the story, he put baby Maui in the rafters over the fire to dry off, which is kind of strange. I wouldn't put a baby over the fire to dry it off, but this is celestial. It's the same figure. It's the same Hercules figure lifting up the arching baby, and the fire is the Milky Way right next to Hercules. But let me just show you, this is actually a text from a book written about the different Maui legends. Here's one version of the story where Maui's mother, Taranga, is talking, and she says, I prematurely gave birth to one of my children, so I cut off the long tresses of my hair, cutting off long hair is also a pattern found in myth around the world. There's lots of hair getting cut off in the Norse myths. The wife of Thor has her hair, her beautiful long hair gets stolen by Loki one time. Anyway, she cuts off her long hair. It's also celestial. There's a constellation called the Hare, and it's right next to a female figure. I cut off the long tresses of my hair and bound him up in them and threw him into the foam of the sea. After that, he was found by his ancestor, Tama Nui Ki Tarangi. So this is that same pattern of the baby being picked up by a powerful figure, in this case, not to cut him in half, but to dry him off. These stories are trying to show us something very important, very powerful. So I actually am finishing up. I just have a couple more things to say here, and then we can close. But this is a really interesting, it's an ancient carving. Obviously, that's a Buddha figure in the front. This is from like the 1st century or so AD. But look, right behind the Buddha has kind of, obviously the seated posture. He's got like an egg in one hand, which is interesting. He's underneath the fig tree there. This is all celestial, I have argued, and I've written about this in some different books. But right behind the Buddha is this protective but powerful Hercules-looking figure. It even looks like Hercules wielding a big, it's actually a mace. Now look over to the right, you can see Hercules. So there's a figure in Buddhism called Vajrapani. That mace is the Vajra. It's a thunderbolt weapon. Remember how I said Zeus is associated with the same constellation as Hercules? Let's outline Hercules one more time. There's the powerful looking, fully bearded or square-shaped head of the constellation Hercules with a big, powerful, menacing weapon. And I will point out, these figures will sometimes play female, sometimes play male figures in different myths. Even Hercules is not always a male figure. There are female figures associated with the constellation Hercules, but in this case, it's a bearded, powerful looking, sitting right behind, protecting the Buddha as the Buddha is there in his contemplation and meditation. Who could that be? Well, it's obviously a Hercules figure, Vajrapani, behind Buddha. Who could the Buddha be? Let me show you. This is the constellation Ophiuchus. I mentioned it before. I can show lots of evidence that the Buddha is also associated with Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus figures in many myth systems around the world represent that higher self, that divine self, through whom we have access to clarity and wisdom and judgment. All those characteristics that Buddha exhibits, that is, you don't have to try and be like Buddha. You already have self inside of you that is like Buddha, that has those characteristics. Dr. Richard Schwartz talks about the characteristics of self, and he lists 8 different adjectives that describe self. And by the way, he didn't just make these up or dream these up. This is what he's witnessed dealing with tens of thousands of patients and realizing that we have these multiple parts of who we are, multiple parts of our personality, multiple aspects of who we are, but all of us have access to this self that's talked about in these different traditions around the world. And when I started to hear his work, I realized, well, this is exactly what the ancient myths have been talking about for thousands of years. The Buddha figure is representative of self. The Solomon figure is representative of self. These are the characteristics of self that Dr. Schwartz has found in dealing with thousands and thousands of patients. Self exhibits clarity of insight, clarity of knowing how to deal with trauma, clarity like Solomon had clarity in that story where he saw right through the situation. He said, bring me a sword. I'll see right through this. All these characteristics of self conveniently start with the letter C. So Dr. Schwartz calls them the 8 C's. So I'll just list them kind of quickly here. Compassion. See, when we're acting in a mean-spirited way or an uncompassionate way, that's not self. That's one of our parts trying to protect us in some way. But when that part, if you can tell that part, okay, can you take a break right now? We're not threatened here. You will actually find compassion. That's self will actually start to manifest compassion. If Dr. Schwartz has this exercise where he says, imagine someone who you really dislike or who really triggers you, really angers you, and put them in a glass room where they can't hurt you, and then have them do that thing that triggers you, and then feel that emotional response, like that anger or that lust or whatever it is that, you wish they wouldn't trigger you like that, but every time you see them, you just lose your mind. Now watch them do it and ask that part that got triggered, that angry part, hey, okay, I see you're trying to protect the system here. Could you go wait in the waiting room? There's some, play solitaire, or there's some magazines there. Go sit outside. And when that part of you actually stands down, now look again at that person who's triggering you. What do you feel now? Well, now I don't feel, do you feel angry or do you feel whatever triggered? No, I don't now. Now I wonder what happened to them to make them that way. I'm starting to wonder, why do they act like that? Why are they doing that? That's actually, now you're starting to feel compassion. Like, what happened to her to make her do those things? That's self actually coming to the fore when those kind of protective parts, you see the protective part in the background, take a break. Anyway, so compassion, I'll list the other ones. Courage, self is naturally courageous. Self is naturally calm. Buddha in the stories obviously exhibits all these things. Curiosity, I wonder, now you're actually connecting with the other person instead of like feeling visceral hatred or anger or jealousy or rage or whatever it is. Now you can, when you're in more self, you start to wonder, oh, I felt that way too. I wonder what happened to that person. Or you can start to become curious as to what's causing the situation. Confidence. Solomon acted with great confidence. And we we know what it feels like to not have confidence, to be divided against ourselves. But when we are more in self, then we act more like these adjectives. So let's see, we're up to 6, 2 more. Creativity comes. So I believe that self is not just able to have human clarity, but sometimes even supernatural clarity and also creativity. Like when an artist gets an inspiration out of, like they say, I don't know where it came from the gods, from the divine realm, that's coming through self and connectedness to others. So let's see, I think there may be, that's all of them. Yeah. So these myths are actually talking about what's going on inside of us. So I just found a public domain picture on the internet of just a person. It could be anyone. What I believe that these stories are showing is what's going on inside us, not just inside us. These kinds of polarizations, they happen in the outside world too. I mentioned like a basketball team, the different characters that are in our heads, the different personalities, they'll exhibit themselves in groups of individuals or in nations, in groups within countries. But they're also going on inside of us. They're going on many levels. We can show that the stories of the myths are not literal. They are celestial and they're metaphorical. So the Solomon story or the Midas story are not literal history. They're metaphorical. So I'm trying to show, what are they for? They're for showing what's going on inside of us. This is a picture of all the different gods of the Greek myths, but those are in us. The different, like angry god Ares is in us, or will come to the fore sometimes in us. But different myths have different characters playing these different roles. I'm not saying that they're not also, outside of us. I'm not saying that there's no divine realm with divine gods or beings, that is probably the case. But it is also true that this is going on inside us. The gods manifest themselves through men and women, or the figures in the Bible. It's not full of different gods. It's full of human figures, mostly playing the same exact roles that the gods and goddesses play in other myths. There's no difference in what they're teaching on the fundamental level. That doesn't mean there's no difference in what later religions layered onto them, but these stories are all fundamentally using the same system. So we have access to self. How do you know what self is like? You can look at Buddha, the Buddha figure. You can look at Solomon. You can look at Jesus. They are displaying the characteristics of self. How do you exhibit those characteristics? Not by trying really, really hard. Anyone who's done that knows that doesn't work. It's through learning to connect more and more with self. Then we'll start to display those characteristics. When other parts are taking over, we won't display those characteristics. So that's, in a short period of time, what I believe the myths are all about. And the evidence is, I've just shown a little tiny bit of evidence, but the evidence is overwhelming that these stories are all connected across cultures, and they're using some profound ancient system that's based on the stars. So I'll stop sharing there and see if you have any reactions or questions, or was that clear,
Yeah, I do.
or was that chaotic?
No, that was very, very clear. I think for me, because I've been following you for a while, it's very clear. But I've got two questions. You talked about the worldwide connection. Do we have any idea about the transmission of the same or similar celestial knowledge across many civilizations around the world? Are we any closer to understanding how we have the same celestial knowledge?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And when I say that, it means it's a really hard question. it's an important question. And I would say that we have to, if we're honest, the answer is no. We don't know, because, I go back to this fact that the most ancient civilizations we know about are already using this system in a fully developed form. Ancient Egypt, the first pyramid texts that we know of are talking about figures like Osiris, Isis, Horus, as if everybody already knows who they are. It's like they don't give you, okay, now I'm going to introduce this figure Osiris. It's like everyone knows his characteristics. It's like this has been going on for a long time. Ancient India, the Vedas, are using this system. Gilgamesh epic, and even more ancient Sumerian texts like the Descent of Inanna. Higher self figures are not always male. Inanna is a goddess who goes down to the underworld, suppression of higher self, and yet comes back. These patterns of gods or goddesses going down to the underworld and coming back, the Jesus story is obviously an example of that, have to do with the fact that higher self is indestructible. You can spear them in the side. No matter what trauma self goes through, self is actually divine in that way. It can't be destroyed. It can't be traumatized. Like the rest of our system can be traumatized, but self retains these incredible, wonderful characteristics like courage, no matter what. It's always there, but it can be buried and suppressed. Anyway, Inanna, the descent of Inanna is a very ancient Sumerian text, and the Sumerians are very ancient. Ancient China, the myths of the Americas. Graham Hancock has recently, in the past couple of years, come out with some compelling evidence that maybe all the civilizations started in South America, or the, you know, like the starting point might have been under the Amazon. You know, look at this incredibly engineered soil that nobody can figure out how to replicate, even in the most modern labs of the most modern universities, that's present all over the place in the Amazon. And it's not just natural, it shows signs that it was engineered. Who did that? Maybe some civilization came, maybe that was the oldest, but we really don't know, because it's probably way more ancient than the Egyptians, way more, and the Egyptians are super ancient, way more ancient than the Sumerians. So it's hard to be definitive at all about that. You know, I've heard people who are definitive and say, well, it's obviously from aliens and blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't know how you, I don't know how you know that. I'm very skeptical of that. I don't deny that it could be from a supernatural origin. I've also said, and I'm not the first person to think of these kinds of directions, maybe plants in the plant world, you know, send us into other realms. Shamanic type patterns are found in every culture of the world. In fact, I have argued that the Bible is shamanic. We have Daniel lying on his face for 3 days. We have, or, you know, lying on his face in a vision. That's a shamanic way of getting a vision. We have Paul saying, I was in the spirit for 3 days, and, or I know a man, hint, hint, who saw these visions. It's shamanic. So maybe shamanic visions come to men and women in a certain pattern that's consistent around the world. That's also part, or maybe, you know, maybe the plant intelligences use this language around the world, and maybe plants are attuned to the stars. Maybe they know the constellations better than we do. I don't know. That's a possibility. It could be lots of explanations, esoteric, but it's profound. It's important. I don't think we know. I think, you know, this book by Graham Hancock, America Before, opens some new avenues for us to explore. And, you know, the discovery of ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe, that is in modern day Turkey, 10,000, I think it was buried no later than like 10,000 BC. So that, if the Egyptians, you know, the first Egyptians were 3,000 or 4,000 BC, which is 6,000 years ago to us, well, then Göbekli Tepe is over 6,000 years to them. Like, it's more ancient to them than they are to us. And they're ancient to us, and we don't know them very well. We can't say that much about every aspect of Egyptian life. And yet they're closer to us than they are to whoever built Göbekli Tepe, which is this mystery. So I don't know. I'm still mostly just exploring this system. I can't explain it, but it's a great question.
And you touched on is it the Maui legend of the baby?
Yeah.
Does that have any connection to the story of Moses or the story of King Saigon?
Yeah, great question. And I think we may have touched on that in our last, did we talk about Sargon in our last conversation?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, so babies being put into water is what you're referring to. Most familiar probably to most listeners through the Moses story in Exodus 1 and 2. After Joseph dies, you know, Joseph was well respected, but then there came a new king who didn't know Joseph, and he started persecuting all the Hebrew babies. And then a mother puts her baby in a basket. She slimes the top with pitch. This is all celestial metaphor, and I talk about it in this new course that I'm about to launch, Celestial Bible Tour Part 2. Sargon, there's an ancient text from the Babylonian or Mesopotamian, Babylonian and Akkadian text talking about this historical, we think a historical king Sargon, but this is written long after we think Sargon lived, but it's written in the first person. My mother was a priestess. My father I knew not. So right away we've got trauma right there. And maybe she, maybe she wasn't supposed to, she didn't know the father. So it's like, she's going to have to hide the baby or get rid of the baby. She put me in the river, and she put me in a basket, and she slimed it with pitch. Well, that's pretty remarkable. And then in India, in the myths of ancient India, there's a story of Mahabharata, which talks about a baby whose name was Karna with a K. And he, as a baby, was put into a river by his mother. His mother was impregnated by a god. This is also a pattern, a mortal woman, a divine father, a mortal mother, because this is esoteric. It's talking about us, actually. We have a physical body that's mortal, but we have a divine spark as well. That higher self is related to that divine spark. That Jesus has the same pattern, if you notice in the Bible. It's very, very common pattern. Many heroes in ancient Greece, their father is Zeus, their mother is a queen of some sort. So they're put into a basket. Karna was put into a basket in this case and floated down I think it's the Indus River. Or no, it's the Ganges River. He was put in the Ganges River. Perseus, in Greek myth, was put into a box. His mother was put in with him in that case, but he was the son of Zeus by this beautiful mother Danae, and they were floated out into the ocean. So this pattern is around the world. Also in Japan, there's a baby named Hiruko, the leech child. He was a child of a god and a goddess in this case, but he was also put into a basket or a ship, a boat made of reeds, which is exactly like in the Moses story. It's a basket in the reeds of the Nile River. It's like, how is that pattern so consistent in all these cultures around the world? And then, like you mentioned, the Maui story is another manifestation of that in a slightly different form, where a mother says, I've decided to get rid of this baby and put him in the water. And he gets rescued. He gets drawn up out of the water. That's esoteric. There's all kinds of esoteric meaning to that. It's the buried self that's buried in the water in this lower body of ours that's made of water. We have this divine spark sleeping in a little basket that we need to draw up. And that's the self that, if you connect with that self, the more we do, the more we can exhibit those traits of judgment that we want to exhibit, like Solomon or the Buddha, and less of the self-destructive traits that we're also familiar with, that we're all so familiar with, of Midas. Great question.
David, thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esoteric. My pleasure.